Okay, so let's start with the first talk. So the first speaker is Eliska Greplova from the Delft Institute of Technology, who will talk about machine learning for large-scale quantum experiments.
Thank you, Giuliano. And thanks to all the organizing team and Galileo Galilei Institute for having me today. It's really such a great workshop in such a awesome environment. So I was already giving a tutorial on Friday, and I see a lot of faces from before. And today I am gonna talk more about some concrete examples of what my group at Galileo Institute in Delft is working on. Just let us repeat this exercise so I know who I am talking to. Hands up, who is high energy? Condensed matter? And cosmos/astro. Okay, so we have a very nice distribution. So so our lab is working at the boundary of quantum computing, machine learning, and topological matter. And these fields, so that's why I come as a quant/quantum information. And these fields have been developing very independently over the last 2 decades, and in the last 5 to 6 years we saw some really exciting overlaps, and that's kind of the regions where my group is working the most. So I want to spend this half an hour I have today to give you some high-level practical examples of how we use machine learning in this interdisciplinary quantum research. These examples include 2 things. I'm gonna explain the motivation for this in a second. One is approximating quantum states efficiently with neural networks. I'm gonna show you some slides in a minute about how quantum states scale with a system size, which is a core reason why we cannot, simulate quantum computers and be done with it. And then the second aspect is that when we are doing quantum experiments on the devices that we cannot simulate and verify numerically, interesting questions arise how to learn models from data that we measure on these quantum experiments. Okay, now I'm gonna swiftly repeat something similar that I was saying on Friday, but please those of you who have been here on Friday, don't go check your email for more than 2 minutes, because this is just going to be a quick introduction. So the central object in quantum physics is the so-called wave function. This is how we describe the states of matter in quantum physics. And the really key problem, or a problem, both problem and advantage, is that it scales exponentially with the system size. For 2 spins, I need a vector of size 4. For 10, I need a vector of size 1000. And for 100, I need a 10 to the 30, which is so we have this huge memory issue about the amount of data that we need to store if we want to simulate quantum physics classically. Hence, all the exciting approximation methods that come from condensed matter and the rise of quantum computing. So just to really quickly repeat, the reason for this is really just that if I have a classical system, let's say that I will have a ball sitting at the 2 different levels of a ladder. They can either be 1 or 0, but you hear all the time the qubit can be anything in between. And then if I wanna then describe the state of n of those, for each of those ladders here, I can put just 1 number per each. So for n spins or n systems, I'm gonna have n numbers. But for these qubits, I need for 2 spins, I need 4 numbers, because I need a combination of 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1. For 3, I would need 8 numbers, and so on and so forth, hence the exponential scaling. So really, this is how you use the richness of this Hilbert space that you have available. So that's one thing. And the other thing are the experimental measurements, because these complex valued vectors, I cannot measure them. So if I measure, I project on some state that gives me some very limited information about the wave function. So there is sort of these two complementary approaches. I can, as a theorist, write some Hamiltonians, solve them by diagonalizing them, write the wave function, and I can complain all day long that it doesn't scale well or whatever. But if I'm an experimentalist, I have even bigger problem because I take some of these measurements, some like numbers, some expectation values, for example, and then I need to connect them to these physics models. And because these wave functions are so complex, we need to collect huge amounts of measurements. So this is this sort of two sides of the coin. As a theorist, I want to diagonalize my models that scales in size with the number of particles so much that I cannot do it exactly. And that's going to be the first example that I want to explain. And the second example is this more practical one. Our experimental colleagues build these systems that have like 100 qubits, 200 qubits. Then they measure something and they want to know what it is. And how do you know what it is without being able to simulate the device? So that's going to be more data-oriented example. Okay, so for the approximating quantum states efficiently with neural networks. If you are from not condensed matter, this slide will not tell you anything. This is just me acknowledging that there has been a lot of efforts. You see that all this paper I'm citing here is from 1955. The idea of approximating quantum states efficiently is not new, right? What I want is to capture the physics that these exponentially large objects have, but only keep storing, let's say, polynomial number of coefficients, so I can actually simulate few hundreds of particles on a cluster or a classical computer. So there are different approaches to this, but a lot of them kind of relies on the fact that the person who defined this approach knows something about the physics. You can say, I will pretend that my wave function is factorizes, so I will just store a product state, or I will pretend that there is some other underlying structure, and then I can be very smart and define this physics motivated ansatz. Then there are ansatzes that have to do specifically with the entanglement structure, which is amount of quantum correlation which is stored in a quantum systems. And then in 2017, Giuseppe Carleo and Matthias Troyer wrote this paper where they said, so this is all kind of limiting because I can only simplify things for things that are, simple enough to be simplified. So let me take a different approach. Let me take something that is completely physics agnostic. So neural network, which has nothing to do with the structure of underlying physics, but I'm going to take this very general neural network and minimize the energy of that and see if I can find the ground states of some interesting models. So back in 2017, this was a very revolutionary idea that gave some very exciting results. And since then, there has been a lot of progress in the field that people use not only this restricted Boltzmann machines, which was this probabilistic machine learning model that was first used back then, but they use deep feed-forward convolutional networks, recurrent networks. There is also a new works with graph networks or attention. So there is a lot of different architectures that you can use. The underlying philosophy behind doing this is that actually give me a raised hand who heard about restricted Boltzmann machine before. I see there is a fun overlap with the condensed matter part of the audience. Okay, so these are just a two-layer neural network, visible and hidden, and they are connected with weights and biases just like you know it. The beauty of this simple model is that the hidden layer is really just learning to replicate the probability distribution of the visible layer. So what we really do here, that these coefficients of your wave function, you parameterize them by the exponential of the energy. That's an expression that comes from the statistical physics, where your energy is a function of your weights and biases in a neural network. After you've done this, you just need to use something called variational principle that tells you that the expectation of your Hamiltonian with respect to your newly parameterized variational function that you got from this neural network will be minimal when it's closest to the ground state energy, because you can imagine that if it would be perfect actual ground state, then you get a ground state energy, and if it's a ground state with a little bit mixed in on something, you get a slightly higher energy. So really what you just need to do is to parameterize your wave function with the weights and biases of this object, and then keep calculating expectation values of the Hamiltonian, which you will try to minimize. And the lower number you can get, the better, because by this guarantee of the variational principle, it will be closest to your ground state energy. So now I showed you some formulas, so we can also just forget about them and we can look at this very pictorially. So if I have a Hilbert space, my actual wave function is sitting somewhere in it. And if I just pick some ansatz, can be neural network or not, but for our purposes, let's call it a neural network, it will cover some part of my Hilbert space, which would be this blue region here. And then if I keep adding parameters to my neural network, I will keep increasing the number of, like the amount of Hilbert space that I can cover. However, you will immediately believe me that this is a very tricky game to play, right? Because there is a limit to me just adding neurons, because eventually if it starts scaling exponentially as the exact approach, then I can give up, right? So it's also important to keep the amount in the hidden layer low, so I don't have too many coefficients that I can optimize. I see a raised hand. Do we have a microphone?
Yes. When you implement the parameterization using the energy, do you have to constrain do you have to incorporate the constraint that the wave function has to be normalized? Or do you, like if you go to the previous slide, no, you have the expression that's in terms of the weights.
Yeah.
But you have to ensure that the sum over all possible quantum states sums up to 1, no?
Yeah, absolutely. So this I skipped, but when you do the stochastic reconfiguration and Monte Carlo sampling, there is always a normalization factor that you calculate. But yeah, great.
But it's not in the architecture, it's in the learning of the. So you don't incorporate it like a constraint on the weights, but only on how you sample.
How you sample, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the question. Right, so we were here talking about that maybe if my ansatz is not general enough, I shouldn't like just keep adding weights. And then the sort of thing that we did with our collaborators, mainly Agnes Valenti, was this idea that maybe we can incorporate a little bit of a physical knowledge into this very physics agnostic thing. But now the incorporating physical knowledge doesn't come from me guessing what the ground state is going to be. We just said correlators are important in physics, and a lot of these Hamiltonians we are trying to solve, they have some correlator terms. So for example, just a simple Ising model has a nearest neighbor, this term, right? So we said, let's add extra neurons to the visible layer. That will be just a product. That will be like a neuron correlator version of this neighboring neuron. So this one would be a product of S1, S2. This one in the middle would be a placket product, and then you can add more. I'm gonna explain this on a concrete example in a second. The thing is that we learned from this that constructing the correlator restricted Boltzmann machine like this actually helps us capture the physics better with the less neurons, well, more specifically with the less weights we need to train. So the example I want to show this on is this toric code Hamiltonian. In condensed matter and quantum information, we care about this super much because this is in the core of quantum error correction and topological phase transition. Is this very cool model that Alexei Kitaev formulated in 2003. And the Hamiltonian just has these two terms, which is a product across the cross here, across sigma axis, and across the placket here, across sigma z. Just again, thinking without formulas, the beautiful property of the ground state of this model is that it's protected in a, roughly speaking, in a way that you would have to flip every spin along the red line or along the blue line to change the topological sector of your ground state. So if I would wrap it up with a periodic boundary condition, I would get this torus, which is then called, that's why it's called toric code. And then you have 4 different combinations of this red-blue lines. So you can encode 2 qubits, and people are excited about this. And now we actually arrived to the stage that these codes has been implemented experimentally on a superconducting quantum computing chips. So this model has a super interesting phase diagram. It's actually, I plotted here without like telling you any details, but the fun thing is that you can drive it from this topological phase by many different ways by adding the fields in the X, Y, and Z direction. And this is sort of like a standard thing to challenge your method, to see what kind of different states and phases and phase transition you can capture. And it's also one of this like a little bit pathological example where here we are plotting in the field in the sigma y direction as an example. If I plot energy as a function of field strength, you will see that for a low field, the exact solution and the RBM agrees, but the stronger field I add, the lower ground state I am getting, but the RBM energy just stays the same. And even if I keep increasing hidden neurons, I am not even gonna get the resolution for the RBM that is on a similar scale as the resolution between first and excited states. So this just means that you got stuck in some local minima, and your model is not converging correctly. So now how these correlators come in? We add into this expression for the variational energy 2 extra terms, which is, we are just adding weights because really we added the visible neurons, so we need to add them to the hidden layer. So we add an extra term for the correlators on the nearest neighbor, correlator on the plaquette. This is coming from the Hamiltonian because they're the 4 spin terms were the most important terms. And then the correlator for the loop, because again, the loop was important to go from topological sector to topological sector. And voila, what happens? Suddenly, again, for this example of the sigma wide field projection, the correlator RBM captures this energy curve very, very well. And just to say that this was not for a one selected example, we picked other Hamiltonians in condensed matter that people care about. For example, whenever we have a triangular lattice in condensed matter, it's kind of interesting because imagine you have a spin here and you have a spin here, and then your Hamiltonian kind of tells you whether this or this energy is better. But if you have a third spin here, you get the so-called frustrated system, right? Because suddenly the system cannot decide which is the configuration that will lower the energy the most. So we tried some of these triangular models where we were adding correlators on the bonds and the 3-body terms. And again, we were able to find a new very good minimum for the variational energy, really just with a physics agnostic neural network. So the conclusion of this first example is that we can use neural networks as a variational ansatz to find new interesting ground states of the Hamiltonians that we cannot solve. And then our contribution is that adding a little bit of the Hamiltonian structure into your neural network architecture can actually help a lot with this task. So this then opens a lot of exciting questions about interpretability and stuff like that, because then you can put a multiple trial correlators and learn which one is the important one when you are trying to capture your ground state, for example. Okay. Yeah, please. There is a microphone behind you.
Thank you very much. So in practice, what we've done is adding these neurons on the last layer, on the visible layer. But this, since they are just function of the neurons that you already had, in practice, you are just modifying your loss function. So the term that you're modifying your loss function does not depend on any kind of data, whatever. So at the end of the day, it just corresponds to adding a prior regularization in which you are suggesting to a network that the configuration that you already know to be unphysical, they are more unlikely. So you're, in some sense, that the neural network the result. So all the local minima you were discussing before, you're lifting them by adding the physics inside that you already had.
Yes. So what's the question?
Yeah, just an observation. So these things are not a modification of the neural network itself, but rather of a loss function, just adding more physics. So at the end, I'm not that sure that your neural network is completely physics agnostic.
Oh, no, this is correct, right? But then there is the interplay between me saying, this is a Hamiltonian, let me try a Jastrow-Slater ansatz or a Hartree-Fock ansatz and just go with it. That's a different level of physical insight. Me saying it's a neural network and the Hamiltonian has a correlator already in it. So I'm gonna input it. But I agree with you that there is some semantics that I call it, I modify neural network because I'm adding a neuron whose value explicitly corresponds to the correlator. But indeed, what it is that this immediately reflects the extra terms that has to go to the wave to the loss function. So in this sense, this is correct, but I would argue that the physical knowledge we are adding, philosophically, we are adding it in a very different sense than guessing this is going to be BCS. So let me try to guess the ansatz in a BCS style. I am really just taking the dominant term that is in the Hamiltonian and forcing the neural network to respect it.
Yeah, in general, there is nothing wrong in telling something that you already know. For example, if it's a generic consideration about your symmetries of your problem or stuff like this.
That's
so
right.
Nothing bad.
Yeah. But this is a correct thing you are saying. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the comment. Okay, let me quickly walk you through this. Thank you. Let me quickly walk you, and it's gonna have to be very quickly then, through the quantum measurement part. Okay, so nowadays, a really big part of quantum experiments is a quantum simulation. Who have heard about quantum simulation before? Okay, so we don't have everyone, so let me explain how it works. The philosophy is that at the beginning, we were all thinking we are gonna have this like general concept quantum computers that will compile your algorithm and do the thing. So this, for various technical reasons, is proving to be very hard. What is not that hard is to trap, for example, neutral atoms in an optical lattice or ions in the electrical fields and be like, let me tune those fields to modify the interaction of these particles such that they mimic some Hamiltonian that is very hard to solve for me. And then I have a system that has 200 particles. I cannot simulate it classically for all the reasons we went over, but I have the thing that is behaving like the thing that I want to study. So I'm just gonna let it do what it does, measure it, and maybe I will learn some physics from it. So that's the philosophy behind quantum simulation. And nowadays in quantum, we have very impressive sizes of quantum simulations with many different platforms. And they are easily reaching 50 qubits up to 200 depending on the platform. And already for this kind of system, Hilbert space size 10 to the 15, you cannot simulate. So we are already building a quantum devices that are outside of this classically simulatable regime. So basically, there are three things that matter for these models, and that's how the two particles interact when they are on the same side, how much they can hop from side to side, and then there is just the energy offset. And then this question comes, right? So how do we learn the parameters of this quantum simulator if we cannot simulate it, but we can measure something? So the question really comes, what are the measurements that I can do on this device that will map very well on the underlying Hamiltonian? So the sort of experiments we were looking at were the so-called out of equilibrium dynamics, because the ground state thing I just explained to you in the previous half of the talk, that's in a sense easier because you have all of these variational methods. Those states can be captured approximately, but starting your state in the initial Hamiltonian, pushing it a bit and let it do some out of equilibrium things, and then estimating the Hamiltonian afterwards from the measurement, that's much harder thing to accomplish. Basically, let's imagine how this works on just like a single spin situation. So I'm gonna start my system in some simple state, like a spin up. And then I'm gonna let it do its thing. So maybe it will do a unitary evolution that it will process like this. And then you can imagine that even for the single spin thing, if the spin is here and I'm measuring in this basis, then I am learning exactly random information, right? But I should still be able to find like the hyperparameters of this experiment and correct measurements that tell me something about the Hamiltonian. In this case, it will be the frequency with which the spin is processing around. That is underlying this time evolution, and this is pretty much what we did. But for the experiments that our colleagues had in a Harvard lab, where they have these neutral atoms sitting in optical lattices, they can do the unitary evolution and they can measure the configuration in a sense which atom is on which lattice side. So specifically, the size of this experiment is 2 × 50 sides. So it's this quasi 1D type of situation that is very long at this direction, but you have only 2 sides along the y-axis. And this is the Hamiltonian I was telling you about. So the atoms can hop, they can repulse each other on the side, and they have some energy. But if I write it like this, I am already lying, right? Because there is no way that optical lattice with some Rydberg atoms trapped in it is going to have a Hamiltonian that is just parameterized by 3 numbers, and that's nothing. Because what happens in practice is that each of these lattice sides has each own parameter. So already if I put 10 particles into 2 × 50 lattice, suddenly I have 350 parameters to estimate. I was seeing my 5 minutes warning, so maybe what I want to do is to move this forward a little bit. We succeeded at estimating these parameters by taking the amount of experimental snapshots they can take, calculate a certain correlators out of them. So we have very relatively small of input vector of like 170 correlators. And then we factorize the problem that each neural network, this is just a supervised learning really, predicts each of those parameters that we are trying to estimate. The trick here was that the correlation length in this system is not actually longer than 8 sides. So we could train on 8 side subsystems and then keep shifting that neural network throughout the lattice to predict all of those parameters. We found that we can predict to 0.1% accuracy of all this many parameters that govern the Hamiltonian. There is one thing that I wanna mention that is interesting, and I hope it won't be like inflammatory to statistical physics people. We noticed that when we try to benchmark it just against Bayesian estimation, when we took many experimental measurements, like 20,000 of them, the distribution of the estimated values was very correct for Bayes and for a neural network. But when we started taking much less measurements, the neural network generalized much better to this low data regime than the Bayesian estimation did. So for us, this was really great because then we could tell them, you can measure just a little bit and the estimation is still going to work. So this sort of generalization power, even in a low data regime, that was very exciting to see for us. So this was just to say that nowadays there are this very large scale quantum devices that are not so easy to simulate, but the parameter estimation can be done with just simulating measurement outcome and training feed-forward neural networks to predict their parameters, and they work very well in a low measurement data regime. So this is 2 things that I wanted to wanted to explain to you. So the first one was, again, approximating theoretically quantum states of neural networks, and other one was thinking about how to take experimental data and map out the underlying model. The second part, I know I went over a little bit quickly because we had questions, but please just talk to me after the talk if you are interested in that. And yeah, I want to finish by thanking all our collaborators, specifically but to Guluxin Jin and Agnes Valenti, who are the two students who were taking the lead on these two projects. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for the nice talk. So we have time for questions.
Yeah, I was curious about this last example you showed about comparing the Bayesian methods and neural networks. Do you have any ideas about why should be like the implicit priors that are going into their structure? Well,
Yes, so I think it's really just because it's not a fair example, because we did the Bayesian by the most naive way, where we discretized all this highly dimensional parameter space, and then we did the maximum likelihood estimation, which means that you need to make like the number of increments. But when the neural network is predicting the parameters, it's just L2 loss. So the Bayesian is always picking. And this was just a numerical thing, because in the end, even with this coarse-grained Bayesian, we would have to run it like for 3 days on the cluster, whilst the network would be done training very, very quickly. So I think it's from the underlying coarse graining of the parameter space, but I would be interested in discussing other possible underlying things.
Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. Sorry, I don't know anything about this field, but I would have liked to ask about the first part of your talk, that you add these physical states. I would have liked to ask about the computational cost, because basically you're adding in another layer, but how much is optimal from computational cost point of view?
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you for asking. So this comparison, when I was saying we compare RBM with our correlator RBM, the number of parameters we optimize is actually the same. It's just, so for example, you could have a vanilla RBM when the inner layer is 10 neurons. And then when I add the correlators to have the same amount of parameters, I can have the hidden layer only 3 neurons. But even like this, the correlator RBM still outperforms, because we made this architecture modification. So all of these benchmarks are very strictly done under the same parameter assumption. It's not that I say I added correlators, but actually I added more parameters, and suddenly it adds more. Like towards more generally in this field, like usually it's exponentially so I should say exponentially, sorry, it's costly because you need to estimate a lot, but we can for like a 100-ish particle, this variational methods generally work, so we don't go out of that regime, but we do it more efficiently, let's say.
So the gain that you take is more on the accuracy part, that's what you want. Okay.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Thank you.
One step back about Bayesian. So you said that you find very different results, and it's harder to generalize, but Bayesian is just the framework. So it's very relevant which prior you are choosing for doing your exercise. Have you tried to vary different priors, see the results? Because if you take a very restrictive prior, then you generalize a lot because you're very opinionated. And that's more or less what neural networks are doing for you. They are choosing the equivalent of a prior regularization. That's very smart usually in a simple way. While for Bayesian, you really have to make a dedicated study in order to guess your best prior for your problem.
Yeah, this is correct. I didn't have time to discuss it. So these comparisons are sort of unfair to the Bayesian because we start from very vanilla prior, and then we see what's going to happen, and then the discretization is in the place. So you are right, and I'm happy to discuss more about
Yeah,
this.
definitely. And maybe you know that in the limit of a very large neural network, a neural net is just an approximation of a Gaussian process. So
Yes.
you can really describe at the end of the day, there is the same underlying idea. It's simply that you have to arrive there from a longest path. But neural network is perfectly fine. Just telling you something more, but that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
I
Either
see
one last
one
question.
more over there.
Thanks a lot for the talk. It was really interesting. I just want to clarify something for myself. When you say correlated RBM, are you implementing a local weight to acting on this for, let's say, sites and then adding them all together, or is it something different?
So the way we calculate this correlator is really, so you initialize your initial layer based on whether the spin is up and down. And if I say I have a correlator 4, I just multiply the spin 1, 2, 3, 4 and save them into the correlator. And then I'm adding extra weight from the correlator neuron that goes into the hidden layer. And this is now a free weight, which is like being optimized just like the rest of the others. So I am really just adding the extra neuron and fixing the value based on the neurons it's correlate, but the weight is freely chainable one. Does this help? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we can stop the question.